So, thank you very much for your kind introduction. I'm very glad to be here tonight. Here you can see my hometown, and maybe you think that it is beautiful. The famous Russian novelist Leo Tolstoy once noted that even though generations of scholars have tried to unravel its nature, it still has remained a puzzle, still has remained an obstacle. I'm talking about beauty. I will come back to the enigmatic nature of beauty in a moment. Let's go to a little thought experiment. Imagine for a moment a world without any beauty, without any experience of beauty. Probably hard to imagine. Can you make sense of such a world? On the other hand, wherever genuine beauty is encountered, there is light, there is joy, and there is enthusiasm. The great Plato is reported to have said, "Beauty gives wings to the soul." Beauty gives wings to the soul. Why? Beauty is a value by which we are delighted, attracted to, and set in motion. And that's why, for example, we call a beautiful person attractive. We are attracted by him or her. In the one who encounters it, beauty awakens love, some striving. Yeah, our soul needs beauty. The philosophical discipline that is dealing with beauty is called philosophical aesthetics. Since the 19th century, however, philosophical aesthetics on the one hand and philosophy of art have increasingly been equated. And this in turn had the consequence that the philosophical reflection of beauty was in a way more and more lost from sight. However, if we ask what philosophical aesthetics is, we could say the following. Philosophical aesthetics is a theory of aesthetic experience, aesthetic properties, and aesthetic objects, or maybe a bundle of theories which are discussing different approaches. And therefore, the reflection of beauty may not be its single subject, but certainly one of its central themes. Great theologians have ascribed a spiritual dimension to the experience of beauty. Think, for example, of Augustine, think of Dionysius Areopagita, Bonaventure, and in the 20th century, great thinkers like Romano Guardini or Hans Urs von Balthasar. In recent times, Pope Benedict and even Pope Francis repeatedly pleaded for a rediscovery of the path of beauty, also called the Via Pulchritudinis. Addressing artists in the Sistine Chapel, Pope Benedict explained, beauty, both that of the cosmos and that of nature, and that expressed through works of art, can become a path to the transcendent, to the ultimate mystery, to God. On another occasion, Benedict referred to the path of beauty as a privileged access to the mystery of God. So far, so good. On the path of beauty, however, we do not only encounter the traces of an ultimate mystery, but also obstinate obstacles. Some of them, at least I think so, haven't received enough attention so far. The first obstacle I want to discuss is related to the enigmatic nature of beauty. In modernity, the understanding of beauty underwent a profound change, a shift, so to speak, from objectivism to subjectivism, from realism to anti-realism. I will explain that in more detail in a moment. So we have the subjectivist challenge and a challenge that I want to call skeptical challenge. In today's discussion about the nature of beauty and correspondingly the nature of aesthetic properties, anti-realistic positions are prevailing. According to them, beauty is not a genuine property of things we encounter in the outer world, but lies in the eye of the beholder. Friedrich Nietzsche, the famous German philosopher, once expressed this view as follows. He wrote, "Man believes that the world itself is filled with beauty. He forgets that it is he who has created it. He alone has bestowed beauty upon the world, alas, only a very human, an all too human beauty." Indeed, most people I've talked to told me that beauty is something subjective, is something that lies in the eye of the beholder. This is a very popular view among ordinary people as well as among philosophers. If these people were right, beauty would be a matter of how we see things, so to speak, through the glasses of our inclinations or preferences, rather than how things really are. If these people were right, how could experiences of beauty contribute to the cognition of God? This is hard to see. How could such experiences, so to speak, open a genuine access to the mystery of God? No, if beauty were just a matter of taste and not a feature of reality, experiences of beauty wouldn't take us anywhere, I think. So, and this is this challenge of subjectivism. There is a second challenge. I want to call it the skeptical challenge. Beyond that, the path of beauty requires a relevant connection between beauty and God. And even if beauty is not only in the eye of the beholder, we still have to clarify whether and in what sense experiences of beauty can give us access to the mystery of God. Among others, it hasn't yet been clarified whether and in what sense the predicate beautiful can be applied not only to created beings, but also to God. In this context, we will have to deal, among others, with the following objection. If beauty is bound to sensual perceptibility, and if God is, by definition, an immaterial being, a being that cannot be grasped by our five senses, it remains an open question, maybe mysterious, in what way experience of beauty might point to God. What follows is divided into two parts. They take on the two challenges just mentioned. In the first part, I will discuss the semantics of the predicate beautiful, and I will do this in the context of the controversy between aesthetic realists and anti-realists. And in the second part, I will try to build a bridge from philosophical to theological aesthetics, from beauty to God. The predicate beautiful is a value predicate. Besides, for example, moral values, there are aesthetic values, like being beautiful or beauty, or sweet or ugly, and the like. There are quite a few. And the predicate beautiful occurs in aesthetic value judgments, the simplest form of which is X. X is a placeholder here for an object, an event, or whatever. X is beautiful. Now, the controversy between realists and anti-realists is about what the predicate beautiful refers to. Realists, on the one hand, say the predicate refers to genuine aesthetic properties. The judgment X is beautiful is true if X has the property of being beautiful. For example, Lisa is beautiful, or it is true that Lisa is beautiful if she possesses this property. Anti-realists, on the other hand, say, no, there are no genuine aesthetic properties. If the judgment X is beautiful is true, it's true relative to a subject that values X, that is pleased by X, maybe because it has some preference for X. If, for example, Peter says Lisa is more beautiful than Mona, all he says is that he prefers the one to the other. Value realists inhabit, so to speak, a world where there are valuable things, where things, so to speak, have colors. In contrast, value subjectivists, or we could also say value anti-realists, inhabit a value-neutral world, a world onto which they project their inclinations and preferences so that things appear colorful. So we have it here, life is beautiful, you just have to see it through the right glasses, so you need these glasses. And such a projection theory was advocated by David Hume, who can be considered one of the fathers of value subjectivism. So now, at this point, we encounter a dilemma. This dilemma was first, or maybe not first, but was already formulated by Augustine at his times, and it points to a fundamental question. Do things please us because they are beautiful? Or is it the other way around? Are they beautiful because they please us? Do things please us because they are beautiful, or are they beautiful because they please us? A very interesting question or dilemma. In what follows, I want to give 3 reasons for aesthetic realism and 3 reasons against aesthetic realism, and these reasons are at the same time reasons for aesthetic subjectivism or anti-realism. So let's start with the pros for aesthetic realism. The first is aesthetic realism is motivated by and based on our experience of value. We experience aesthetic properties like being beautiful or being ugly as properties of objects which we encounter in the outer world, in the external reality. We don't say, my glasses through which I see Lisa are beautiful, we say she is beautiful. Secondly, some aesthetic value judgments also enjoy much cross-temporal and cross-cultural consent, and this speaks also in favor of aesthetic realism. If there is a let's for example look at this guy. I don't think that there are many human beings who find him or her or whatever it is beautiful. And even if someone said, "Oh, this guy is beautiful," I think we might say, maybe you make a big mistake in speaking this way. Maybe it's an error. Or maybe you will just joke. You want to joke with us. So this kind of cross-temporal and cross-cultural consent speaks for objective value judgments, or something like this. And then we have a third reason. We often do not treat aesthetic value judgments like mere judgments of taste. For if this were so, it would be like arguing about whether vanilla ice cream is better than strawberry ice cream. But a Latin proverb already tells us that such discussions are useless, lack sense. De gustibus non disputandum est. About taste cannot be argued. But actually we argue about taste from time to time, and also about beauty. So now aesthetic value realism faces, on the other hand, not only reasons which speak in favor of it, but also a number of serious objections, and these objections speak in favor of a kind of aesthetic value subjectivism. Let's look at these reasons. The first reason is the disagreement objection. It goes like this: if there were such entities like genuine aesthetic properties, then there shouldn't be so many and so far-reaching disagreements about what is beautiful or ugly or whatever. And in many cases, we readily agree on the non-aesthetic properties of an object, but at the same time, we disagree on its aesthetic properties. For example, think of Leonardo da Vinci's Mona Lisa. We may readily agree that it is painted with oil paints on poplar wood, that it has got this and that height and length, and so on. But do we actually agree on the exceptional beauty of this painting? I don't know. But of course we will find people who don't find it very beautiful. So then the second objection of aesthetic realism is the queerness objection. Compared to empirical or descriptive properties, the nature of aesthetic properties, which are value properties, appears to be strange, not to say obscure. So we know many we think that we know what empirical properties are, but it's not so clear what value properties, metaphysically spoken, really are. And the third objection is the unknowability objection. Aesthetic properties cannot be adequately grasped by sense perception and/or logical thinking. So the question is, do we not need something like a more or less occult organ, an organ of cognition, to get in touch with these properties? The anti-realist has a very simple explanation of all these problems. He says, There simply are no such entities like objective aesthetic properties. Full stop. So we have to go back to our dilemma and ask, is there a way out? I want to suggest such a way out, and in doing so, I will argue that the two horns of the dilemma, so we have, are things beautiful because they please us, or do they please us because they are beautiful? I will argue that these two horns do not really exclude each other. And I will take 3 steps. First, objective aesthetic properties are a variation of so-called secondary qualities, secondary properties. According to a distinction going back to John Locke, secondary qualities such as colors, smells, or sounds, in contrast to primary qualities such as extension, density, or weight, have an irreducible subject reference, an irreducible relatedness to subjects who can perceive something. And in this sense, secondary qualities are neither completely independent of subjects. In a world without subjects, there wouldn't be colors, sounds, or smells. At least nobody is there who sees or hears. Nor are secondary qualities mere projections of subjective preferences or inclinations onto the objective reality. Secondary qualities are relational properties. Relational properties that are neither purely subjective nor purely objective, in the sense that they are completely independent of subjects. They belong to the total reality that encompasses both things and subjects. A viable realism should therefore take into account that something beautiful is always beautiful for someone who can perceive it as such. So there's a difference between subjectivism in the sense that I'm the measure of what is beautiful or not, and what I said, that there's a relation from beautiful things to subjects who can perceive something as beautiful. So this is the first step. Aesthetic properties are a variation of secondary properties. Second step, aesthetic properties like beauty are constitutional properties. Aesthetic properties, I think, are higher level properties, properties of a greater whole, like properties of systems. They result from the relations of the elements of a system or whole. As such, they are ontologically dependent on non-aesthetic properties, and they are constituted by them. They are made up by them. Think of the painting Mona Lisa. Beauty is not a property beside all the empirical properties, but it is somehow made up by the interplay of all the empirical properties, non-aesthetic properties. Semantically speaking, it is important to see that the meaning of the predicate beautiful cannot be defined by non-aesthetic properties like length, density, order, or whatever. Being beautiful is more than to confirm to certain non-aesthetic properties like proportions and so on. So for example, here we can see proportions, which you can call the golden cut, but beauty is more than just to say that there are certain proportions. I will explain that in a moment. What is constitution? Here we have 6 matchsticks, and they constitute, through their spatial relations, the way they are ordered, a tetrahedron. The tetrahedron is not a new, in a sense it is a new being, but there's nothing more than these matchsticks and their spatial relations. And they constitute something, they make up something. And this is made, this I mean by constitution. And then we have a third step. Aesthetic properties are dispositional properties. What are dispositions? Dispositions are causal properties. Properties then that can bring about a causal effect. As such, they can be analyzed as four-digit properties. They encompass four aspects. A disposition bearer. Think of the painting Mona Lisa. The painting is the bearer of this property that can play a causal role. Then we have a reciprocal disposition partner. Think of an observer, like the novelist Dostoevsky. Then we need appropriate circumstances, sufficient observation conditions, like the needed distance, enough light, and so on. And then we need a stimulus. The stimulus in this case is the eye contact between the observer and the to the painting. And if these factors are present, an object like Mona Lisa exemplifies or can have the effect to appear beautiful to an observer. So, yeah, in this sense, aesthetic properties like being beautiful are secondary qualities. They are constitutional products, and they are dispositional properties, properties which can play a causal role. If we generalize this, we can come to the following working definition. An object or an entity X is beautiful if and only if X, in virtue of its non-aesthetic properties, possesses the dispositional property of evoking, under appropriate circumstances, the experience of being beautiful in subjects of a species who perceive X sensually and or grasp it mentally. So far, so good. Surprisingly, this approach is not far away of Thomas Aquinas' view. In the Summa, he says, "Pulchrum autem dicator, id cuius ipsa apprehensio placet." What is said to be beautiful is that whose very apprehension pleases. Aquinas defines the property of being beautiful by its causal effects on subjects. And in this sense, he is very modern, I would say. What is beautiful is that whose very apprehension pleases. And this comes close to my dispositional approach too. Aquinas treats the property of being beautiful as a, one could at least say, secondary quality, and at another place he calls beauty a property of the senses. On the other hand, for Aquinas, beauty is not a purely subjective property, but rather an aspect of being. Two features of beauty he names are consonance and clarity. Beauty is a trans-categorical attribute. It is something that can be said or possessed of all being, or is possessed of all being. The beautiful and the good are ontologically the same, he says. They can only be distinguished conceptually. So we see that he has a differentiated, nuanced stance on what beauty is, and it would need more investigation to figure that out. but I wanted just to say that there are some parallels between my approach and his. Okay. The result of part 1 is that a moderate aesthetic realism gives at hand an alternative to aesthetic anti-realism, as well as a kind of objectivist realism that doesn't take into account the subject relatedness of aesthetic properties. So we can say that the dilemma can be solved if we take this way of a moderate aesthetic realism. And I want to sum it up. Aesthetic properties are, I suggest, secondary, constitutional, and dispositional properties, and thus they are less weird or mysterious than the queerness objection suggests. The unknowability objection also fails because aesthetic properties are grasped in virtue of their effects on subjects. And for the third objection of manifold disagreements, we can reply, aesthetic properties cannot be derived from subjective preferences. Rather, they stand in correspondence to human preferences, some of which are deeply rooted in human nature. So what I want to say is that there's a correspondence between the aesthetic properties, for example, being beautiful, and human nature, and some kind of capability of perceiving something. So we have to consider this correspondence. We come to an interim result. The project of a via pulchritudinis wouldn't come off the ground if we had to stick to aesthetic anti-realism. But if my remarks are right, the experience of beauty doesn't only lie in the eye of the beholder, but does have a foundation in things themselves. And that in turn refutes the first challenge on our way, the challenge of aesthetic anti-realism or subjectivism. And this interim result allows us to continue on our way, on the way of beauty, and to address the relationship between beauty and God. And this brings me to the second part of my talk. From beauty to God. The Franciscan theologian Saint Bonaventure, in his biography about Saint Francis, stated the following: In all things of beauty, he, Saint Francis, contemplated the one who is supremely beautiful. In all things of beauty, he contemplated the one who is supremely beautiful. That's a theological statement. And the question is, can we make sense of it? And if, how? A first hint can be found in the Book of Wisdom, chapter 13, verse 5. There we read, "From the greatness and beauty of creatures, their creator is seen by analogy." By analogy, this Greek word, analogous, occurs only in this place in the Septuagint. These two statements are in need of interpretation, and in what follows I shall attempt one. Saying that the world was created means, among other things, every being that differs from God is ontologically dependent on him. It cannot be without God. This is a kind of one-sided dependence. The creatures depend on God, but not God on the creatures. And this one-sided dependence is a special kind of relation, and therefore I represented it in form of an arrow. So the world and everything it contains is this kind of, is dependent on God. And what was created by God is not only dependent on him, but it is also similar to God and at the same time dissimilar to him. Contrary to God, who is all perfect, the positivity or perfection of created beings is limited. And we call this limitation or can call it negativity. We could also call it imperfection. And what is important is both aspects, positivity and negativity, similarity and dissimilarity, can be distinguished conceptually, but in reality, they penetrate each other. So they cannot be distributed on different things or areas of being. With other words, negativity is nothing in itself, it's just a lack of perfection. And what is important to see, the positivity of created beings establishes their similarity with God, while the negativity of created beings establishes their dissimilarity with God, the God who is all perfect and does not lack any perfection. Yeah, and the question that arises is whether beautiful is not only something positive, but also whether we can attribute it to God or not. Can we say that the limited beauty of created beings points beyond itself to the unlimited beauty of the Creator? Not least, the answer depends on whether beauty is a pure perfection. Scholastic philosophy distinguishes between mixed and pure perfections. What is a perfection? It's an actualization of possibilities of being, or to say it short, a way of being. But there are two kinds. There are mixed and pure perfections. What is a pure perfection? A mixed perfection, a perfectio mixta. It's an attribute which, according to its conceptual content, includes some kind of limitation. I give you an example. Seeing with the eyes is some kind of perfection. It's a good thing to be able to see, but if you see with eyes, that implies physicality, and physicality implies some kind of limitation. A pure perfection, a perfectio pura, on the other hand, is an attribute which, according to its conceptual content, does not include limitation, although its mode of realization can be limited. So my example is cognition simplicita. According to the concept cognition, it does not include any limitation. We can say of God that he knows everything, that he is all-knowing. On the other hand, human cognition is always limited. Cognition would be a pure perfection. Other examples of pure perfections are goodness, power, love, and the like. So the question is beauty a pure perfection? This question is necessary or important because we want to ask whether we can call God beautiful or not. If we understand God as an infinite and perfect being, no mixed perfections can be attributed to him. We ask, therefore, whether beauty is a pure or a mixed perfection. Now remember Thomas's definition, pulchrum autem dicatur id cuius ipsa apprehensio placet. What is said to be beautiful is that whose very apprehension pleases. And maybe we remember also that he said beauty is in some sense a property of the senses. Proceeding from this, the following objection can be raised. Only sensually perceptible beings can be apprehended. Perceptibility implies materiality. Materiality implies limitation. Since being beautiful implies limitation, it is a mixed perfection. Since God, as a perfect being, doesn't exemplify or possess any mixed perfections, beauty cannot be attributed to God. So is this a good argument? I do not think so, and here is why. Not only material beings, but also abstract entities, such as ideas, novels, composition of ideas, or compositions, music, or even mathematical equations can in principle be experienced or at least grasped as beautiful, even if they by themselves do not have a material realization, because a composition is not the same as a sheet of paper where some notes are written on. It's an abstract thing. It can be realized in this and that, at this and that place, but that's not necessary for the composition as such. And therefore, I think it's not by accident that Thomas does not speak of sense perception, but of apprehension. And apprehension is a broader term. And therefore, I think prima facie nothing speaks against taking beauty to be a pure perfection, and in this case, it can be attributed to creatures as well as to God. Okay. Yeah. There is another question we should address briefly. Why should we think that a limited realization of a pure perfection like beauty, in the case of a landscape, points to God's unlimited beauty? Not the only, but one possible answer is, if something is not limited per se, then there needs to be an absolute standard relative to which something can be more or less limited. With other words, we can only make sense of more or less limited beauty if there is an objective and absolute measure or standard, something which is of unlimited beauty, and that we call God. God is the reality which possesses all pure perfections, and beauty is one of them, to a maximal degree, and therefore is an objective absolute standard. And if this is so, the beauty of creatures points beyond itself to an infinite being, which is at the same time a perfect being, and this perfect being is a summum bonum, a highest good, or as Bonaventure also says, a summum pulchrum, a highest beauty. If we apply the predicate beautiful to God, we can discern two perspectives: the perspective of a theology of creation and the perspective of a theology of revelation. In the light of a theology of creation, all created beauty points beyond itself to God's uncreated beauty. All created beauty is a parable, so to speak, of His goodness and beauty. So, we have the world, and all beautiful things are, in a sense, a reflection or a parable of God's beauty, of the all-perfect God. But there is another question. In the light of a theology, or let's put it differently, we can ask what God's relationship to the world is like. And how it is connected with our question of God's in what sense God is beautiful. An answer to this question emerges in the horizon of God's self-revelation in Jesus Christ. God's self-revelation makes apparent that God's love does not have created beings like human beings as its benchmark, but God Himself is the measure of His love. This insight can be unfolded in terms of a Trinitarian theology. God's infinite love for man and world is to be explained as the uncreated love of the Father for the Son, which is the Holy Spirit in person. God's self-revelation discloses, so to speak, a formerly hidden matter of fact, namely that the world is created into this divine Trinitarian relationship. We could maybe talk about it like this. So we have one perspective, the order of creation, and within this order, the world's beauty can be experienced or seen as a parable of God's beauty in himself. But we can also take on another perspective, a Trinitarian perspective, and within this order, the world's beauty can be experienced as a parable or reflection of God's glorious love for us. Hans Urs von Balthasar, following Bonaventure, regarded God's self-revelation as a work of art of God. From the gestalt, the form, the species of this work of art, the light of divine glory emanates. The light of divine glory which illuminates the eyes of faith and raptures man. This gestalt of Jesus' life testimony, the overall event of his words, deeds, signs, suffering, death, and resurrection, is the final and unsurpassing manifestation of God's love for us, of his glorious, his wonderful, his most beautiful love. So in this sense, God's beauty is the perceivable aspect of his love, which he revealed in his self-revelation. To the eyes of faith, every good experience, especially personal experience, becomes a parable of the supernatural community with God, which is beyond human comprehension. So let's look back. Not ready, but almost. Great theologians and popes invite us to follow the way of beauty, the via pulchritudinis. My talk took up two challenges on this path. Part one took up the controversy between aesthetic realists and anti-realists. It defended a moderate aesthetic realism as a way out of the old dilemma that already Augustine had formulated. And according to this moderate realism, beauty does not only lie in the eye of the beholder, but is also a property of the things themselves. So and I think this is enough. Part two outlined the philosophical and theological semantics that underlies the path of beauty, thereby taking into account both a perspective of theology of creation and theology of revelation. I close with a phrase. In Dostoevsky's novel, The Idiot, we find the astonishing statement, "Beauty will save the world." Beauty will save the world. Is this true? I think it is. Why? Simply because it will ultimately be God in his all-perfect, in his most beautiful love, who saves us. And all earthly beauty is a reflex of his beauty. So now I will